All right, welcome back to Archie's Acres and the VSAT program. This lecture is going to be on Compost Tea, which is something we use quite a bit here at Archie's Acres. We're going to dive into a little bit. By the way, if you're a student of VSAT or within the alumni of VSAT, in the student and the alumni groups on our webpage is the Compost Tea Brewing Manual written by the guru of Compost Tea. A lot of great, more in-depth information in that manual, and it's a very easy read, so I encourage you to go check it out. But diving into a little bit of compost teas. What is compost tea? It's a cold brewing, water extraction of compost and other organic matter. So when we think of tea, we typically think of boiling water and all that. Compost tea, we don't boil the water. We may heat the water a little bit just to get it into the 70s or so, and that will speed up the expansion of microbial life within our tea. But it's a cold brewing, and we're trying to extract some of the benefits of compost. The main benefit of compost is microorganisms and organic matter, as well as some of the nutrients. And one of the things that compost tea does, it speeds up the metabolism of the organic matter, because the microorganisms in the brewing process reprocreate very rapidly. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Again, this allows us to extract the nutrients and organisms from the compost, and organisms required to establish all the benefits of the healthy soil food web. We've discussed this a little bit in our soil lectures with Eric Boyd, but the soil food web, if you're in organic agriculture, is key to drive our nutrients for the plant with as little effort as possible, all right? Allowing microorganisms to be our laborers in this process is a very cheap and easy way, and they also help keep our plant healthy as well. Microorganisms not only live in the soils and potting mixes, they live in our water within our reservoirs of our hydroponic systems, and that's how we can do organic hydroponic systems, and they can actually colonize the tissue of the plant as well, and the benefit of doing that is it'll help defend from foliar diseases and so forth. So types of compost tea. The most common type of compost tea, and the only one you should really be focused on, is aerated compost tea. And this is where we use either water pumps or air pumps to either using water pumps to circulate the water, or using air pumps to pump in air into the tea and essentially bubble the water. One thing we want to be sure of with the term aerated compost tea, refers to high levels of oxygen in the tea. This is where our beneficial microorganisms, this is the environment that they prefer, high oxygen. If our oxygen levels come down to a point, there's a chance that the beneficial microorganisms can asphyxiate and die off, and they'll be replaced by yeast and non-beneficial microorganisms. So we want to stay away from that. We want to make sure our water that we're brewing in has high levels of oxygen. The best way to do that is to A, either constantly move that water, B, inject water through the use of air bubblers and air stones, air pumps and air stones. And also by doing that, we can create turbulence on the surface that's going to help us get oxygen in the water as well. Aerated compost tea can be applied to the soils. We can put it in our hydroponic reservoirs. We can apply it as a foliar spray. A lot of things we can do with this stuff. And it encourages root growth, protects the roots, can provide nutrients, and we'll get more into that here in a minute. And then there's anaerobic tea, all right? Stay away from anaerobic tea altogether. Anaerobic tea refers to lack of oxygen. We just talked about that briefly. When oxygen levels get down to a certain point within our water, our beneficial microorganisms will asphyxiate and die off, and again, they'll be replaced by the yeast and so forth. All right, and we want to stay away from that altogether. So I would not encourage you to play around with anaerobic teas. This is a very basic compost tea brewing system. It doesn't take fancy equipment to make a batch of compost tea. As you can see here, they're basically using just a 5-gallon bucket, and then you could take like a bag, a burlap sack or something like that, fill it with compost or whatever ingredients you're using, suspend that in a 5-gallon bucket, use a simple air pump and some air stones and bubble from below the sack holding the compost up through it, because what we don't want to happen is that compost to kind of solidify, not getting oxygen in the center of that compost filled sack. We want to be able to penetrate oxygen and water everywhere in that sack, and this simple process will help us fastly reprocreate the microorganisms in that compost and extract any nutrients that are available in that compost as well. So very simple systems on a small scale. Again, it's just about a 5-gallon bucket. Other systems include, you see this guy just took a burlap sack or something, a 55-gallon drum, filled it with water and suspended the sack in the drum itself. Again, as time goes on, the microorganisms that are now in the water will start using the oxygen that this water has contained. And as it uses up that oxygen, it depletes that oxygen, and at some point, those microorganisms will drown due to lack of oxygen, because you see here there's no air bubblers or nothing moving that water. And so the brew time in here, you're going to want to keep it probably 12 hours or less to ensure those microorganisms don't asphyxiate. This is the system we actually use here at Archie's Acres. This is actually larger. This is about a 1,000-gallon system. But you can see that somebody's holding up this mesh basket. This is actually where we put our dry ingredients in, the compost and everything like that. And then that sits in the water. We have air pumps that bubbles the water and help us create that high oxygen rich environment within the water. And you see there's a couple other systems here as well. There's actually another system called a vortex system that essentially pumps the water from the bottom of the system back into the top. So it'll pump into the top of the system itself, and it does so in a directional motion, which makes the water act like a vortex, and that process replaces air stones within the system. I've heard good things about both systems. I don't know which one's better. Again, this is the one we use here at Archie's Acres, the one in the bottom right hand of the screen. Compost quality is critical, all right? We want to ensure we're using compost that's rich in mycorrhiza and other beneficial organisms. A good compost manufacturer will probably be able to tell you what's living inside of it. In fact, if you go to a garden center or something like that, you buy a lot of compost mixes, and they'll list out the microorganisms living in that compost mix. So we want to buy or use compost that's rich in those mycorrhizas and other organisms. But more importantly, most composts are created with the use of animal byproducts. And one risk of animal byproducts is if it's not composted in a healthy environment, it could potentially be an area where E. coli and salmonella can develop, all right? And then when you put contaminated compost in a brewing process, those organisms will rapidly reprocreate. And then you spread that all over your crop. Now you're going to potentially contaminate your customers with a disease that could potentially kill them, all right? So we want to ensure compost quality is of high integrity and that's rich in organisms that we want to help us within our crop. Aerobic conditions, again, high oxygen levels by keeping the water constantly moving through the use of water pumps or air stones. Moving on, anaerobic teas. One thing to note about anaerobic teas, where aerobic teas or aerated teas, we can use as a foliar spray using the soils. Anaerobic teas, again, we want to stay away from those. Another reason is because they prefer environments that lack oxygen, so you can't apply them as a foliar spray, because as a foliar spray, it's going to be surrounded by oxygen, so any organism that was living in an anaerobic environment will more than likely just die off and have no effect in a foliar environment. The purpose of applying compost tea is to return to biology that should be present to grow the desired plants with as little effort as possible. So one of the ideas of compost tea is if you have soil that's rich in organic matter, we apply compost tea that's very rich in microorganisms. The microorganisms break down the organic matter in the soil and derive our salts, our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from the organic matter for us, which prevents us from having to buy supplemental fertilizers for the application in our soils. Now that's for soil growers, all right? If you're in a hydroponic system, you're using compost tea, you want to use compost tea to use the microorganisms to help defend the crop from diseases and so forth. What we at Archie's Acres do is we do it a little bit differently. I'll talk this more in a minute, but in our compost tea, we also add ingredients that are very rich in soluble nutrients like guanos. Bat guano, for instance, typically has, or seabird guano typically has high levels of soluble nitrogen. All right, so as we're applying our teas through our hydroponic reservoirs, not only are we applying it with microorganisms that will help protect our crop and keep it healthy, but providing the nutrients that are needed for the crop to grow as well. Some things we want to know as growers: what biology should be present in our soils or in our systems, what organisms are in the compost. We talked about that a minute ago. The equipment that we're using to apply the teas shouldn't be detrimental to the organisms that are surviving in the teas. So what I mean by that, if we're using a sprayer that we use to apply pesticides with, those pesticides might be detrimental to the organisms that we're putting in our teas. So we either want to A, use different application equipment, or B, ensure we fully sanitize the application equipment before we go from a harmful chemical to the compost tea, so we're not having a conflict with our results. And the proper delivery of organisms with food can lead to success. And again, we need food source and we need the environment. Now, diseases, the reason why we get diseases is because the disease needs a host, that's our crop, and a favorable environment. All right, and that's usually an environment that's too much water, lack of oxygen, whatever the case may be. Well, beneficial organisms are the same way. They need a host, which again is our crop, and they need a favorable environment. That means a food source, which is organic matter typically, and high levels of oxygen present, as well as moisture, adequate levels of moisture, not over moisture. Okay, so why are organisms important? Beneficial bacteria and fungi are needed to immobilize nutrients. All right, what we mean by immobilize as opposed to mobilize nutrients is nitrogen, for instance, comes in many different forms. You have solubilized nitrogen and insoluble nitrogen. Solubilized nitrogen is what we call nitrogen in salt form, also what's referred to as synthetic form. All right, solubilized nitrogen, when water hits it, is dissolved into the water and can move through the soil profile very quickly, right? And the danger of that is, and the trouble part of that is, when you apply water, what we don't want to happen is for those nitrates to be pushed below our root zone so the plants can't use it anymore. Beneficial microorganisms can actually lock up that nitrogen, hold it in place for the crop to use. And we'll talk a little bit more of that here in a minute. They can prevent erosion as well. Microorganisms can prevent erosion. Certain microorganisms like algae and funguses can create glue-like substances that actually bind soil particles together and can somewhat restrict the soil from moving in terms of water and prevent erosion a little bit. Again, it competes with disease organisms for food. So in organic agriculture, the best way we can defend our crop is ensuring that there's high level of microorganisms because they compete for food sources, and it makes it difficult for any one organism to get out of control and become a problem like a disease-causing microorganism, pouty mildew, root rot disease, whatever the case may be. Competition is the best way to suppress those diseases, and the best way we can get competition is through ensuring there's high levels of beneficial microorganisms, and we can do that through the use of compost teas. And microorganisms also allow us to help build soil structure. They'll allow the plant roots to grow deeply into the soil if you're a soil grower, and help the plant find more access to water and nutrients. And again, it ties back into the soil food web. The soil food web is a full circle of life. All right, so protozoa, which are little tiny organisms that live in between the water, live in the water in between soil particles. Nematodes are little organisms that live in the soils as well. And microarthropods, which are tiny. An arthropod is like a spider, a centipede. Arthropods are smaller organisms, but the same species. They live in the soils as well. Well, those organisms consume bacteria and funguses, all right? And when they do this, when they consume bacteria and funguses, This process then releases nutrients for the plants to use and consume. All right, so the funguses and bacteria will actually immobilize the nutrients, and then the microarthropods and protozoa and nematodes will then consume the bacteria and the funguses, and that'll release some of the nutrients for the plants to use at a later date. All right, our conditions for the habitat, again, a good food source. One thing we apply in our tea for a food source is molasses. Now, molasses is a little bit difficult to work with, but it's a byproduct of sugarcane, right? So it's high in glucose, which is used as a food source for microorganisms. Organic matter is a food source and one of the cheapest and best food sources to use. Temperature between 65 and 85 degrees. Now, here at Archie's Acres, we have a heating source that keeps our brew system in the 70s. All right, now you may not have the money up front to buy that heat system, may not have access to it, whatever the case may be. If your water gets cooler than 65 degrees, it's okay. In fact, the good thing about cooler water is there's more dissolved oxygen in the water. But if you do have cooler water, you're going to want to extend your brew time for either a couple hours or a couple days to compensate for the lack of microbial growth because of the cooler water. All right. Now, if you go hotter, the challenge with hotter water at 85 degrees is warmer water has less dissolved oxygen in it, and it can slow growth as well. And if you get too hot, obviously you're going to kill off the environment. You're going to kill off microorganisms because they can't survive in that environment. You want your salts within range. Again, water, even tap water out of your faucet comes with salts in it. All right, so you want to make sure, and if you're using well water, you want to make sure you don't have any harmful salts, too much sulfur, or whatever the case may be, that they're within range. You see nitrates and sulfur less than 3 parts per million within your water. You can figure this out through simple water tests at a local lab or something like that. No toxic levels of any materials. And one key thing, particularly if you're using tap water, is you want to make sure the water is dechlorinated. All right. Now there's several ways to do that. For one, you can just empty the water into a large container, right? Have a hose, fill up a large container, and let it sit there for about 24 hours. And the chlorine will just burn off over about a period of 24 hours. You can speed that process up by using an air pump. Put an air pump with air stone in the water, allow the water to boil for a few hours, and that chlorine will burn off. And I've also heard, but I haven't used this myself, by using a little bit of hydrogen peroxide can help burn off that chlorine pretty quick too. So chlorine is pretty easy to get rid of, and you can get filters, simple filters that will help you filter out the chlorine within the matter, almost seamlessly. But we want to make sure we get the chlorine out. Not all tap water has chlorine, but much of it does. This is just a graph of the soil food web. You see it's very complex. You start down here in the bottom left-hand corner with dead plant or animal material. And then through this process, you can see what starts feeding on it, and then what starts feeding on what's feeding on the organic matter. And the byproduct of this whole soil food web is, for one, a healthy environment and a crop that's protected, and two, nutrients for that crop to consume. But again, it comes down to A, the environment, one that's rich in oxygen, B, food source, organic matter. With those two, and knowing what type of compost you're using in your tea brewing process, you can help trigger this reaction and create the soil food web and have a very healthy environment for your crops. Both within soils, within hydroponic systems, both deep water cultures like water culture systems like our NFT, or media-based systems like Dutch buckets and so forth. So over the years, we found that what we consider these days conventional farming, has deteriorated soils because we've been heavily relying on tillage, and tillage kills microorganisms for several reasons. One, the active tilling exposes a lot of air into the soils, and what that does is speeds up the metabolism rate of the microorganisms. We talk about having an environment that's rich in oxygen. Is there an environment that's too rich in oxygen? Yes. Why? Because that'll speed up the metabolism rate of the microorganisms, and they'll consume all the organic matter at a faster pace than you could provide it, which means they'll run out of a food source and they'll end up dying off. So we've lost organic matter in the soil because of tillage. The use of pesticides has degraded our soils by killing off a lot of microorganisms. Inorganic salts, meaning we've been applying high levels of salts that our microorganisms can't survive in as well. Compaction of the soils, again, using farm tractors, equipment, and so forth that's compacted our soils. That makes less oxygen available in those soils, and that can kill off microorganisms. And we need to know that when we harvest our crop, when that crop comes out of the soils or comes off our farm, it's taking nutrients with it, and that needs to be replaced. Now, if we have rich environment of microorganisms, what needs to be replaced more often than not is just more organic matter. And a lot of times, the microorganisms could do a lot of the work of driving the salts needed to grow the crop for us. So is compost tea a fertilizer? Yes and no. It really depends on what you're putting in the compost tea. If you're just using compost, it isn't much of a fertilizer, but the tea itself, again, is going to metabolize organic matter, which that process will then derive nutrients. You can see conventional chemicals application will require about 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen added per year. Now, some of that nitrogen the crop doesn't even use because it's solubilized and it leaches through the root zone, doesn't get used up. But if we're managing our microbiology properly, the microbiology will lock up the nutrients and allow us to use it when the crop needs it. So the only thing we're losing when we harvest, or the only thing we need to put back after we're done harvesting, is the amount of nutrients that we lost in that harvest, not what's being leached below the root zone that's not going to be able to use in the future.